Be easing from eastern Scotland this afternoon and through the course of the evening. Further south, many places will be dry, and in the west, where it's clear tonight, well, we will see a frost, certainly for Northern Ireland. We're likely to see a frost through parts of Wales, the West Midlands, even some southern counties of England starting the weekend at or around freezing. So a chilly start, but generally a sunny start across the south and west. Still a lot of cloud across the east. Some patchy rain. This line of rain may just gradually work westwards, but nothing like as heavy or as persistent as it has been. Eastern parts of England may finally brighten up a little bit. Temperatures, again, only single figures for many. Certainly feeling a lot cooler than last weekend. Might get up to 10 or 11 in the southwest. Then more rain comes in on Saturday night with some blustery conditions as well, leaving behind a lot of showers for most of us during Sunday. Goodbye.
We are GB News, and we'd like to say thank you to each and every one of you for bringing us your conversations, for helping our great nation find its voice. We are here for you on radio, television, and online, across England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland.
It's not the BBC, you actually get your facts right.
We are proud to be GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
My name's Tom Harwood, and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today. I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked. Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Every Friday and Sunday night from 9, it's Mark Dolan Tonight.
We're on the same page again. There's something weird happening.
Let Ian finish. Don't be such a cranky.
That mini budget was the tip of the iceberg.
And on Saturday, my show just got bigger. From 8, it's Mark Dolan's Saturday Night In.
You can't govern a country if you can't speak. Stop talking.
My God, we reached the end. I've never been early in my life. Only on GB News, the People's Channel.
Join me, Arlene Foster, for The Briefing on GB News. Every Friday at 3 p.m, I'll give you all the latest political news and analysis, and we'll have robust live debate. To make sure that you're caught up on all of the biggest issues of the day, we'll bring on experts in their field. I'll ask the questions that you'd like to ask. We're not afraid to tackle discussions from all perspectives, including yours. Don't forget, The Briefing with me, Arlene Foster, every Friday at 3 p.m. on GB News.
We are GB News, right across the nation. You can get us on television, on radio, on digital. We're absolutely everywhere.
Amazing! You see, amazing!
You remind me of me in the European Parliament. But here's the most important bit. We are not part of the mainstream establishment. We think and speak just like you do. We are the People's Channel.
Magnificent. That's really, really thoughtful.
Come and join us on GB News, the People's News Channel.
the highest tax burden in recorded history. That's what the Office for Budget Responsibility say is the consequence of the autumn statement. Well, I've got it here, and we're going to explore the only story in town. What does the autumn statement mean? How painful is it for us, our families, and indeed our businesses? And will it do anything to reduce inflation? We'll be exploring this all and the political reaction to it after the headlines.
Good morning, it's 9:31. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. The Chancellor's defended his economic plans announced in yesterday's autumn statement as the right thing to do. Jeremy Hunt's admitted the next 2 years will be challenging, but says people want a government that makes the difficult decisions. Labour says the Chancellor could have made fairer choices and has called for a serious plan for economic growth. Experts say living standards are expected to fall over the next 2 years to 2014 levels. Retail sales rebounded last month. According to official figures, the Office for National Statistics says sales increased by 0.6% in October, higher than analysts had predicted. It marks an increase on September, which saw a 1.5% drop, thought to be due to the Queen's funeral. The owner of a luxury hotel in Kent has told GB News he rejected a government offer to house asylum seekers because he couldn't think of anything more absurd. In an exclusive interview, Richard Martin, who owns the blazing Donkey Country Hotel near Sandwich, confirmed he was offered over £1 million for a one-year contract. He said he rejected the offer because he wasn't prepared to make most of his staff redundant. And Royal Mail workers have announced a further series of strikes in the run-up to Christmas. The Communication Workers Union will walk out on 6 dates in December, including Christmas Eve. That's in addition to the 4 days coming up over the next 2 weeks. Royal Mail has called the action damaging. TV online and DAB Plus radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to Tom with the briefing.
Well, good morning. It's 9:33 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. Well, that was that yesterday. We have a budget of sorts, an autumn statement, as they're calling it. Not content with reversing the measures in the Truss mini-budget, this government has decided to go further still. Not just returning the tax burden to where it was previously, but raising it to new highs. Indeed, the highest level in recorded history. That's according to the Office for Budget Responsibility. Gone too are most of the supply-side reform measures touted by Truss. Gone are the measures to accelerate infrastructure development, level up with enterprise zones and deregulate the economy. Instead, tax hikes, spending restraints and nothing fundamental to jolt our ailing economy back to life. But is this the necessary, if painful, medicine that this country has to have? Or was it all a missed opportunity? Well, today on The Briefing, we're going to be exploring that very question. We all know we're in for a painful 2 years ahead, likely more than 2 years. Many of these measures written in this Green Book by the Chancellor stretch until 2028. That is the pain that this country is in for. But is it all necessary? Is it needed in order to survive this inflationary crisis? Does it actually lessen the blow of stagflation that this country was facing? Well, we'll be exploring all of this with Matthew Lesh from the Institute of Economic Affairs in just a moment. But before then, there was one element of this budget that got a cheer from the Tory benches. I was sitting up there in the press gallery as the Chancellor was delivering this statement, and it was remarkable to see the gloom, the abject misery on the faces of Tory MPs behind him. One moment, however, burst that gloom. One moment delivered a cheer from those Tory benches. It was, of course, the Chancellor confirming the triple lock on pensions was being maintained. Pensioners were to receive an inflation-busting pay rise of over 10%. Well, just before that statement, as we were expecting this triple lock to be announced, to be maintained, I spoke to Baroness Ros Altman, campaigner on pensions, a former pensions minister. I asked her whether spending an extra £11 billion on pensions was the right thing to do, given the economic context.
Average income of people in work is far higher than the state pension, for example, and millions of pensioners have little or nothing other than the state pension, which is pretty much the lowest in the developed world. And what I think is important to stress is that because we pay deliberately such a very low state pension, and we know that of the current cohorts of pensioners, not enough of them ever had a chance for a private pension. Today we've made changes, so for future pensioners that will be different. It's really important to stress that it is a political choice whether the country pays a decent increase or not. It's not a question of whether the country can afford it. We are one of the richest countries in the world, yet we pay one of the lowest state pensions. Therefore, it would be politicians choosing not to spend the money on protecting their pensioners rather than a question of affordability.
That's a compelling case for those who rest solely on the state pension. However, 2/3 of pensioners don't. 2/3 of pensions have their own private pensions, other sources of income. What's the argument against means testing any increase so that those pensioners who are millionaires, as 1 in 4 pensioner couples are millionaires, for those pensioners who own their own homes and so aren't affected by house price inflation, actually are helped by house price inflation in the cases of those pensioners who rent out property? Why should all pensioners, especially those millionaires, be getting increases? Why not focus it just on those who are relying on the state pension?
We tried relying on means testing already, and the result of that was a sharp rise in pensioner poverty, because when you take away the universality of the state pension and you rely on people having some extra savings, if they are at the margin and they can't be sure that they're going to be able to save enough, they don't bother to save at all, because they think, well, if I do, I'm going to be penalised for it, because only the people who didn't save are going to get this much better pension than I'll ever get. So we have a system based on national insurance where the fundamental promise is you pay into national insurance, or you contribute in some way to the system through your working life, and the state will pay you a basic amount of money in return for that if you've contributed for enough years. If you start undermining that social contract, then you take away much of the basis on which our whole system works.
Baroness Ros Altman speaking to me in the House of Commons a little bit earlier. Well, let's get more on the entire context of this budget. Joining me now is Matthew Lesh, the Head of Public Policy at the Institute of Economic Affairs. And Matthew, first of all, obviously it was a political choice to deliver more spending in some areas and restraint in other areas. The big winners are those on benefits, those on pensions, and indeed the health and education departments. Just about everyone else has been squeezed. In your view, was it the right mix?
Yeah, I think you're right, Tom. This is a massively redistributive, big state, big spend, high tax budget. There's quite simply no other way to look at it. We're basically taking with one hand from the productive part of the economy with high corporate taxes, high taxes on capital gains, allowing bracket creep, putting up income tax at the higher threshold. And then we're using that money for transfer payments to pensioners, to many of whom are millionaires, homeowners. We're transferring money to welfare recipients. We're transferring money into the healthcare system that's completely unreformed. We're putting more money into education. Now, all those things are nice, but I think you're right, these are choices that the government's making to effectively say, despite this rhetoric about fiscal sustainability, there's not that much fiscal sustainability in here, let's be honest. The amount of government budget deficit will keep going up. There's a theoretical 0.2% reduction in national debt in 5 years' time, as if anyone can believe these models that never end up being particularly accurate, particularly that far out. So we're basically getting the worst of every world. And on top of that, where is the plan for growth? How are we going to actually grow the economy so we can all be more prosperous? Well, everything the government talks about is very top down. It's all about what government's spending public R&D money on. It's about what the government's spending skills money on. All this talk about planning reform, about dealing with childcare regulations, all these kind of very important areas of reform to grow the economy seem to have almost entirely disappeared. It's all quite disappointing, Tom.
One of the big differences between this autumn statement and the former Chancellor's mini-budget is we don't just have the government's document here, the autumn statement itself, but we also have a companion document compiled by the Office for Budget Responsibility, which assesses all of the policies announced by the Chancellor. Now, one of the graphs involved in this Office for Budget Responsibility Economic and Fiscal Outlook was looking at the tax burden, the level of tax that is wrought upon society. We can show that graph right now, and as viewers will be able to see on this graph, which I believe we can show right now, there it is, the tax burden in 2023-24 is rising to the highest level it has ever been on record, higher even than the level of tax that we saw after the Second World War. It's the most remarkable picture, and all of this under a Conservative government.
What's even more depressing, Tom, I think, is in some ways is we're paying more tax than ever, but the quality that we're getting public services seems to be worse and worse. We've got 5 million people waiting for NHS treatments. We have constant concerns about the fact that the police will never actually turn up if you report a crime. We have less road building in the UK than comparable countries. We have less infrastructure than we need. So we're paying more and more into the state, and we're not getting particularly good outcomes. Perhaps we could justify Scandinavian level taxation if we actually got Scandinavian level services. In fact, we're paying Scandinavian level taxes and we're getting basically the bottom of the rank, Eastern European, if not lower quality services. Maybe that's a bit of an insult to Eastern European services. I'm sure that they're actually improving, unlike in the UK. And this is the sorry state of affairs, because the government, despite all this rhetoric about tough choices and doing unpopular things, they're basically taking the coward's way out in every way. They're not willing to take difficult decisions like on planning that might boost economic growth. They're not willing to reform public services like the NHS because it would be too controversial. They're not willing to not put up pensions and welfare in line with inflation because it would be criticised by the Labour Party and by sections of the media. Every single choice in this budget is basically the path of least resistance rather than the path of ambition and reform and growth.
It does seem like the anti-growth coalition, so coined by the former Prime Minister, may well have won in many aspects of this autumn statement. But Matthew, you've produced a graph, you've been sharing it on your own social media, about the debt implications of this policy. Here it is for those watching on television. Now, those two little lines that are dotted out into the future, the difference between the blue and the orange line is the difference between the Truss mini-budget and the Hunt autumn statement. It's remarkable how little difference there is in terms of the level of debt this country has.
Yeah, it's quite extraordinary. We're basically on the way to an extremely high debt, no matter whose projections, unless you're willing to do some quite radical changes, rethinking the role of the state or growing the economy enough or actually reducing spending. So whatever the circumstance here is, despite all the rhetoric about, this is a fiscally responsible option, I mean, it's slightly more fiscally responsible in the sense that we've got a full forecast and we're seeing potentially maybe in 5 years' time the deficit go down. What's most interesting, I think, is for the next 3 years, where the government actually has the most control, certainly up into the next election, we're basically just seeing more spending and more taxes. We're not really seeing debt go down at all. In fact, debt will be going up over the coming years as a proportion of the economy. So it doesn't really feel like, despite all these promises about fiscal sustainability, we've got any more than a nod to that. Now, what's interesting, of course, is because they've at least done these figures, there does seem to be some sense of at least rhetoric around it, which seems to calm things down in the gilt markets and the foreign exchange markets. But I wouldn't say that this is a great victory for fiscal conservatism.
Well, on that happy note there of that positive assessment of where we are as a country, my gosh. Matthew Lesh, thank you very much for talking us through the measures in the budget there. But how might people react to this budget? Of course, as we were discussing there with Matthew Lesh, so many of these elements of the budget are more political than economic, predicated on how people may respond to them. Well, let's talk through where the public sits on these issues. I'm delighted to be joined now by the founder and director of Delta Poll, Joe Twyman. And Joe, I recognise there's been no time for these big assessments on how people feel about the budget to have been done. But clearly on issues and prioritisation of the British electorate, the budget, in the way that it has prioritised health and education, pensions and benefits, seems to be looking for what the public is most aligned with. Did they hit the mark
yes.
right?
Sorry, go on.
Yeah, did they hit the mark right?
Yes, to an extent that is that's true. But the most important issue, when you ask people what's the most important issue, either facing the country or facing themselves, is the cost of living. And a lot of this is about dealing with the cost of living crisis, whether it's paying back money that's going to be used for the energy price cap, or similar things, or indeed ultimately paying the money back for furlough during the COVID pandemic. It's all about attempting to deal with that to various degrees. But the interesting thing about public opinion when it comes to events like this is that, generally speaking, most people, the average person in the street and the 50% of people less engaged than the average person in the street, really aren't paying that much attention to the minutiae. The detail around specific policies is not what's important. And yes, you can ask people, and indeed we do, whether they support or oppose particular policies and a whole range of policies. But what's more important is how people perceive the whole package, not just in the immediate aftermath of the announcement, but in the days that follow as they start to digest and think about what impact overall it will have on their circumstances. And so that means, do they think it will be done fairly? Do they think it will be done effectively? Do they think it will be right by them? And then ultimately, do they think their economic circumstances will improve as a result?
Government seem to be very, very keen to emphasise the fairness of these measures. They produced, alongside the autumn statement, a distributional analysis document showing that this is wealth transfer from the richest to the poorest. The bottom 4 out of 10 households have a slight increase in their circumstances. They're better off due to the measures. But the top 55% of households, so a majority of people in this country, are worse off as a result of these measures. It seems in that way, in that focus towards redistribution, and in many of the measures, the windfall taxes, the raising of the, or rather the lowering of the threshold of the top rate of tax, making more people pay that top rate of tax. It's a very Labour budget, to some extent, in that way. The Tory party driving its tanks onto the lawn of the Labour Party. Is there much difference now between the opposition and the government?
Well, it could be presented as a Labour budget, and certainly that's one interpretation. I think it is broadly fair, but that you could also argue that it's broadly representative of a Conservative Cameron era budget. During the first period of austerity in 2010 onwards, when George Osborne was Prime Minister, when George Osborne was Chancellor, we heard repeatedly about the idea of those with the broadest shoulders bearing the most weight. And really, I think it would be an attempt to sell things in those terms as well. But you're right that there are similarities with Labour, and that then raises the question about if, and I do stress if, in the eyes of the public, Labour and the Conservative Party are seen as relatively similar in terms of their specific economic policies and the broad narratives around it, then it comes down to which party the voters think it will be best placed to introduce those policies and actually make sure they're effective. And so that goes back to the argument about these broad narratives. And I imagine that in the wake of what we saw with Liz Truss, the government still has some way to go in terms of regaining that reputation for economic competence. Certainly a Delta poll, in our most recent polls, we see that Conservatives are still 10 points behind on who would be the best party to deal with the economy when you give the choice of just the two main parties. Now, that's a significant improvement on the 20-point lead that Labour had previously, but it's still a long way behind. And it's worth remembering that a party has never come from behind on economic policy and leadership to win the most seats at a general election. And as things stand at the moment, admittedly with 2 years potentially until a general election, that's the situation that Conservatives are in.
Well, that is an absolutely fascinating piece of analysis there. If the public see both parties as basically the same on policy, they'll look to competence. And perhaps that explains why the Labour Party has been going so hard on the accusations of sleaze, of bullying, of competence, of appointments, of personalities, rather than of policy. Everyone from Suella Braverman to Gavin Williamson to Dominic Raab, these seem to be the flashpoints at Prime Minister's questions over the past few weeks, rather than big ideological disagreements. Perhaps that is where our politics is going for the next 2 years. I'm afraid we've run to the end of the interview there, but Joe Twyman, thank you so much for your analysis there. It's an absolutely fascinating time in politics, and we'll have to have you back as soon as we've had some polls on in terms of what the public have made of this autumn statement. Well, let's turn now to our political reporter, Catherine Forster, who's at Westminster for us. And Catherine, the political reaction in the House of Commons over the last 24 hours has been an interesting thing to see. Very, very glum members of Parliament, most of whom on the Conservative side.
Yes, that's right. The Conservatives are very quiet at the moment, and also I would say really very gloomy. I was in the chamber yesterday, was really struck by how quiet they were, how glum the faces were, as I think the magnitude of the mess that the country is currently in is really starting to hit home. Gone are the optimistic, predictions, the progress, growth, and now lots and lots of hard choices and tough medicine to take. So at the moment, obviously they're no longer running around like headless chickens as they were under Liz Truss, as they went down to 14% in the polls. They are calmer. They've gone back to their constituencies. They'll be hearing what ordinary people make of this. They'll be looking at what the IFS have to say this morning. They'll be looking at the polls, very gloomy papers. But really, they're in a very difficult position because they have been in government for 12 years, and generally, if people feel worse off, as we are told we're nearly all going to be over the next couple of years, people tend to blame the people in charge. Now, there have been a few Conservative MPs coming out and being openly critical. Not surprisingly, the business secretary under Liz Truss, Jacob Rees-Mogg, was saying last night that tax rises were the wrong way to go. The government should be focusing on making sure that taxpayers' money was spent wisely, looking for efficiency savings. Also, from a different wing of the party, Charles Walker has written in The Independent today. The biggest cheer yesterday, I think, was when the Chancellor revealed that the triple lock would stay and pensions would rise at 10.1%. But Charles Walker has written, and he said that they're feather bedding the retired at the expense of the young. And of course, although the government has gone out of its way to be seen to be fair, to protect the most vulnerable, those on benefits, in contrast to Liz Truss's government, many pensioners are really well off. But of course, over 65s tend to vote Conservative.
Interesting stuff. But in our final 30 seconds, where does this put the Labour Party? The government's just announced further windfall taxes, tax hikes on the richest, redistribution, uprating benefits. I mean, where's the difference between the parties now?
Well, that's a good question, because clearly the Conservative Party have moved much more to the centre. Rachel Reeves has been speaking this morning, still saying they would have made different choices, still saying not gone hard enough on windfall taxes, on private school fees, non-dom status. But increasingly, the point of difference between the two parties definitely has narrowed.
Well, Catherine, thank you for bringing us that live from Westminster. That's it for the programme today. Thank you for joining me as we digest this monumentous statement. Don't go anywhere, though, because Esther McVeigh and Philip Davies are next with their programme here on GB News. So that after the weather.
Don't miss my brand new GB News show, Gloria Meets. In exclusive interviews, I'll be finding out who our politicians really are and what they really think.
I think I've seen probably quite enough of Matt Hancock to last me a lifetime.
I'll also be getting to know you better, travelling to find out what you think about the politicians who are fighting for your vote.
They've got to get this country back on track.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m, only on GB News, on TV, radio and online.
Good morning, I'm Alex Deakin, and this is your latest weather update from the Met Office. Many of us looking a bit drier out there today, but for eastern parts of Scotland it will be a very, very wet day. Here's the reason why. A bit of a dartboard low just sitting there. It's been gradually working up the eastern side of the country, and around this low the winds are just feeding into eastern parts of Scotland. So heavy and persistent rain likely here, certainly for much of the morning. We do have a Met Office amber warning in place. The likelihood of further flooding along with fast-flowing, dangerous rivers. The rain will extend more widely across northern Scotland. There'll be some showers in southwest Scotland, northwest England, the odd one in the southwest, but generally across the south it's dry and a bright day with sunny spells, and a lot drier today across northeast England compared to yesterday. Temperature-wise, single figures, maybe 10 or 11 in one or two spots, maybe 12 or 13 along the south coast, but certainly feeling colder with a very strong wind continuing across northeastern parts through the day and overnight. The rain, though,